The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you everyone for joining us for another Learning Lunch hosted by FormatApproved.com. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Training and Education with Formed Training, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's Learning Lunch will cover when to hire versus when to contract HIT staff. We are joined today by David Kushan, the Managing Partner of Healthcare IS, a leading national search and staff augmentation firm. He has been in staffing for over 20 years, with the last 15 spent on assisting organizations with their clinical HIT needs. He is also a frequent blogger at Healthcare IT Today. If you have questions during this session, please enter them into the chat area during the presentation. In the second half of our presentation, we will address as many questions as time allows. If we do run out of time, answers to all submitted questions will be posted to our website and sent via email link later in the week. Also, as we are often asked this question during the session, please note that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email with links to both the recorded and PDF versions of the event. All right, well, let's begin. So let's begin with this question. What are the benefits of both contractor and full-time employment options for HIT staffing?
Sure, Brian, and first of all, thank you very much for having me today. For contract staffing, there's a couple things to think about. Number one, the first benefit would clearly be the ability to get somebody on your team quickly, speed. Many times a need will pop up unexpectedly or even part of a project, and you just don't have the time to go through an entire hiring process. And a good, strong contract resource will help you in that area. Second is flexibility. When you only need somebody for a short period of time, or there's specific skill sets that you need, or you have to augment some of your current team, having the flexibility of a contractor that can come and go when you need them is very beneficial. And then lastly, for a lot of organizations, it's kind of a reduced overall liability. There's not many restraints on when or how you eliminate a position that may occur when you're hiring somebody on a full-time basis. In terms of the benefits for an FTE, well, you're going to have that person long-term. They're an asset. They have knowledge. Any knowledge they gain while they're working within your organization is going to stay with the organization. Also, having a team that you can count on and a loyal person to your organization is certainly going to benefit in the long run. And also, when you're building a good, strong team, a lot of times with a contract resource, you're just primarily looking for the right skill sets that can come in and do the work. But when you're building a team and looking for FTEs, you can certainly benefit by having people that are going to fit into your overall corporate culture, client interfacing, and developing relationships with people in the long term in the departments that you're supporting.
So when it comes to the consistent branding, you're saying there that there's having a consistent roster of personnel helps you have that consistent branding. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Many times from an IT standpoint, your customers are the other internal people within other departments within the organization. And even though you may do a project for an organization that lasts for a short period of time today, you're certainly going to be supporting the work you've done for them, and you may have other projects for them down the road as well. So the ability to build relationships with those end users or your customers can certainly enhance the working relationship as time goes on, as opposed to having a contract resource who will come in and do the work for the short term, leave the organization once the work is done, and down the road, if you completely just relied on contract resources, a new relationship would have to begin each time.
I see. So what types of projects and positions are connected to HIT hiring?
Well, I think there's many, and the first thing I'd like to clarify for just a moment is the lines between HIT and informatics are getting a little blurry from organization to organization. IT at some point is eventually the main department responsible for implementing many of the software and technologies that we see in clinical environments today. but many of the tasks that were traditionally called IT are beginning in informatics department. So I would say that what I'm about to mention would apply to both. Generally speaking, and without getting into too much detail, because as you get into department levels, a lot of the projects can get very specific. But what's really big today is the implementation of new systems in general, specifically the software that you're finding from departments throughout all organizations, whether that's something that's used at a desktop level or from a mobile standpoint. The adoption, training, having the end users actually get engaged with the new technology that's being implemented, something that's very, very big today. Then once these systems are in place, there's continual ongoing maintenance and support, so you need teams in place to help with that. And software is constantly improving and changing and trying to keep up with the new demands that are being put upon clinical environments today. So there's always constant upgrades. It's a never-ending process. So those four main areas in implementation, adoption, maintenance support, and upgrading of systems today.
And depending on the role and the organization, I assume that there's often an inside-outside aspect to this as well, that implementation will involve people coming in to implement the system, and then maintenance and support may be more in-house staff on an ongoing basis, or maybe an MSP of some kind. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to find that in using, there's a certain amount of, I guess the best way to say it is you want to make sure, organizations would like to make sure that they've got their full-time staff a part of all of these processes. Most of the time, outside resources, contractors are brought in to help with the implementation phase. Having said that, organizations want to make sure that the information that's gained, the knowledge that's gained through the implementation process, a good portion of that, if possible, can stay with the people that you're going to keep in-house, because the information you gain while implementing system can certainly be beneficial to people who have to maintain and support the system, and also be a part of future upgrades.
That makes sense. Typically we hear that when it comes to EHR implementation, for example, you don't get a lot of support from the company necessarily after the implementation is complete, so all of that in-house knowledge becomes all the more valuable, I have to imagine.
Now, when you say the company, are you referring to the vendor whose solution you're implementing?
That's right.
Yes, right. Well, that's true. Every vendor's a little bit different in each of
Sure.
those categories, but what you certainly find is there's a team to help you implement, and there's a team to help you support, and the more you can keep it in-house, the better off you're going to be.
All right, well, let's go to the next question then. When would you suggest that an employer consider a project-based contractor?
It's a good question. I think that goes along with some of the responses I gave a couple slides ago. I think number one, when you have an immediate need. If something happens within the organization and for whatever reason you realize you're going to need a resource, and you're probably going to need that resource sooner than you would be able to hire that resource on a full-time basis, that's the number one. That's one way that people immediately begin to consider using a project-based contractor. Number two is if there's specifically a project. There's a beginning, there's an end, there's a set of skills or a knowledge base that you need specifically for something that's going to take place. That's another situation to give consideration to a project-based contractor. And then lastly, with a lot of provider organizations, I would say when you have situations where the expertise you're looking for is very difficult to find, many provider organizations who employ HIT professionals are in geographic areas where there are no other HIT departments to potentially recruit people for or from. So they'll have an opening that needs to be filled. They'll have a type of person that they need to hire based on certain skills and knowledge, and there's no one in a local market that you can hire. So then you begin to look outside of the area for a hire. Somebody's going to probably have to relocate, and that's just going to take a period of time, or something you can't just rely on. So you've got to begin to integrate having project-based contractors as a part of your overall strategy with ongoing projects that take place within the organization.
So what avenues are available then for employers to find good project consultants?
Well, I think the first step is a consulting firm or a staff augmentation firm. There's a difference there. Consulting firms will bring a level of perspective and expertise and be a partner that can help you make decisions with the direction of projects. Sometimes the lines are blurry. Sometimes a person who can be a consultant can also act in a staff augmentation type scenario. And just to be clear, I consider the two different in the aspect of a consultant will help you come in, make decisions, and provide direction. Many times organizations just don't need that. They have put the direction and the plan in place, but they then recognize they just don't have the right skills or knowledge. And that's what I refer to as staff augmentation. So you can go to one of those two types of firms. Building a partnership with a firm over the long haul can be very beneficial. They'll get to know you potentially as a hiring manager. They'll know your culture and your team. They'll be aware of what skills you might need in the long run. So they can constantly make sure that they've got good pools of experience available when you need them. Other organizations try to do this on their own. You can ask internal staff for referrals, colleagues they may know, people that might turn to people that you know who could be aware of other good project consultants that come in on a project basis and then just handle it directly with the organization. And then, of course, there's the consultant network on formetapproved.com, and another good resource is Healthcare IT Central for trying to connect with these consultants directly.
So when is it more financially logical then to hire a full-time technology position rather than use a consultant or a project-based situation?
Well, I think number one, if it's a long-term need, I think that if you're going to look for a skill set or knowledge base that you know the organization will need beyond a current project, that's certainly when you're going to want to start leaning towards a full-time position. Secondly, as we discussed before, when you have somebody representing the IT department interfacing with other departments, it's certainly going to be beneficial to have relationships established. The better the working relationship, the better the communication, the less likelihood that things fall through the cracks when the projects are taking place within the organization. So there's benefit when there's going to be a long-term interaction with other departments throughout the organization. And then lastly, when it's a position that can grow, when you're looking for somebody to not only do a job today, and when I say grow, it doesn't, what I'm talking about is a role that's going to have to gain knowledge over time. So many departments, I'll give you an example, pharmacy, IT, and informatics is an area that we do quite a bit of work in. Pharmacies are beginning to bring people in who are their pharmacy IT expert. That's a position that not only is there today to implement whatever or help with whatever projects are taking place, but that person's going to kind of become a knowledge expert within the organization for pharmacy. So anytime that role is going to continually gain new knowledge that can be drawn upon, or it would be very beneficial to have that person in-house to draw from down the road, that's another time where financially you're going to want to keep that person in-house as opposed to constantly reaching out to a consultant and starting over with someone new.
In some sense, it seems to me it's a question about, when is it a good idea to invest in human capital and when is it better not to? And the reasons you give here make a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
So,
I think
go ahead,
if you're
please.
going to need them long, if you're going to need that if the knowledge, the more that the knowledge that's, well, let me say it a different way. If you have a project today and the knowledge someone would gain from doing the work on that project, the more that knowledge is going to benefit the organization long term if it stays in-house, the more financially you would lean towards hiring a full-time person as opposed to letting that knowledge walk out the door, which will inevitably occur with a contract, project-based person, and then start over with the next person down for the next project.
Sure, it goes back to that inside-outside question we were discussing a few moments ago.
Exactly.
So what are the most important skill sets then for an HIT professional who's going to be in a full-time employment role?
You know, I get asked that quite a bit, and you know, there's a way to think about this that's a little bit different than most people think about it. I started off, I'll kind of start it off with this. The software, the tools that people are using in HIT roles today will inevitably be different than what they're using 5 years from now. If there's somebody who's been in the same position with a hospital IT department today, if they've been there for 10 years, they're not going to be doing or working with the same tools that they were 10 years ago. So from a hands-on tool standpoint, that tends to be the driver of what many organizations are looking for when they're making a hire today, because there's immediate needs that have to be dealt with. But what I tend to look at are the skill sets that aren't going to change over time. The skill sets that are important are the skill sets that are going to be necessary for today, as well as 5 years, 3 years, 10 years down the road, regardless of what software is in place. So the skill set that comes with a good clinical background and knowledge of clinical workflow is something that isn't going to change with whatever software comes in. Good, strong project management skills, again, regardless of the project that comes in or the organization is currently working with, those types of skills are going to always be beneficial. And then just general expertise specific to dealing with EMRs are going to be beneficial for anybody that you can bring in into a full-time role, keep a part of the organization over the long haul.
Are there other aspects to it that we might consider as well? Like, I wonder if, you know, there's dispositional qualities or I mean, maybe it's the same across employment, but I wonder if you find that a certain type of person is especially well suited to these roles, or is that not the case?
You know, what I found, the reason I pause a little bit is really, every organization has their unique characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
I think people that, I think it's more of a key of, if an organization's looking to hire someone long-term, really being aware of what their organization is, how their organization is, what it can be like to interact internally, and then specifically finding the types of individuals that fit best within their organization. I've seen some where they're just different characteristics, as with anything. Some, a lot of patience is necessary, and others, hitting timelines are going to be necessary. And the organization and its culture are going to dictate which of the two are more important than the other. So I think for organizations, as opposed to looking for a general type of individual, it's very critical for them to be aware of themselves as an organization and understand what type of personalities or disposition are going to fit best within their organization.
That's interesting. So how do people find these candidates then? Are recruiters the way to find, whether it's FTEs or consultants? How should people go about fulfilling their needs?
Well, I think the key is they can go to outside firms, and we touched upon consulting firms and referrals or some online resources. But I think the key is finding the right firm for your specific position. Now, there may be firms that can handle all of your staffing, but I would sometimes be a little wary of that. There's a lot of new firms that have come into the marketplace. I mentioned a little bit earlier, our firm, we focus specifically with organizations that implement Siemens solutions and Cerner solutions. And because of a need and a niche that we saw develop, so much of CPOE being medication focused, we have very specific practice to making sure that we have pharmacy professionals that are on staff. But I could also say there's a lot we don't do. We don't do a lot in Epic. We don't do a lot in the McKesson world. We do a little bit, but not as much anymore. So I think when people are out talking to firms, just to be a little bit wary of the firm that appears or gives the impression that they can do everything. Because from my experience, unless they're a very large firm and have them broken down into specific practices, most organizations don't do everything exceptionally well. The key to finding a good staffing firm or consulting firm is knowing what type of skill sets you might need either on a planned basis or on a spontaneous basis, and maintaining a relationship with a firm that will constantly have accesses to those resources, and it's very difficult for firms to have access to all resources. So the firms that tend to really specialize will be the ones that have the highest likelihood of being able to get the right resources to you when you need them.
It sounds like a lot of this involves preparation on the employer side as well, really outlining the project appropriately and understanding what their needs are.
You know, that's an excellent point. Many times companies will call us, hospitals will call us and say we need somebody next week. When somebody calls me and says we need somebody next week, I'm pretty much drawing from whatever resources I know are available right now. There's not a lot of time to deliver many options at that point, if that makes sense. But if somebody gets in touch with us and says we're going to need somebody 60 days from now, well, that might give us a 45-day lead time before we then need to present the options to them, which, you know, inevitably the longer you're able to foresee your needs and pass that on to your staffing partner or consulting partner, the more time they're going to have to, you know, produce better results for you.
So you've touched on this a little bit, but what type of recruiter can be helpful in finding the right candidates then?
Well, I think from a full-time position, there's going to be a couple of different types of recruiting firms you can work with. And then there's also firms that do permanent staffing as well as contract staffing. And then there's firms that do either or. The key to understand is that recruiting or consulting firms are drawing from pools of people who have specific skill sets and knowledge. And just understanding that they're different pools of people. So for instance, people that are generally going to be open to considering full-time roles normally are not the same people who are open to considering contract project-based roles. Now, people do fluctuate in their careers from being full-time employees and then maybe for a couple of years doing contract work and then go back to full-time employee or vice versa, but they typically don't go back and forth continuously. So the first step is to understand that the firm you're going to reach out to, they need either specialize in one or the other in both. And if they don't give you the impression that they really specialize in that area, they may not have access to the type of resources or as plentiful access, and you may not have as many options. On a full-time basis, there's going to be recruiting firms or search firms. They'll either work on a retained or on a contingency basis. The higher level within an organization that a position may be director or above, you might get more into a retained situation where you're going to work exclusively with one firm and make a financial commitment to them prior to them engaging in trying to identify the right resource for you. Contingency basis are firms that will present viable candidates to you, and you will only pay them financially if you hire their person. So those are a couple of different options on the full-time basis. And then specifically, you've got the contract firms that will bring people to you on a project basis. And again, finding one that specializes, you know, as an example, in our firm, we are not only aware of the current contractors that we have working and when they're going to be available, but because of the demand that's picking up, we're constantly in touch with the types of, we're in touch with people who have the types of skills and knowledge that we know our clients are going to need, and doing the best we can to recruit new people to our firm to meet our client needs down the road. So just making sure that you're working with a firm that truly does specialize in one of those two areas based on your needs.
So given the shortage of HIT specialists, there's a lot of questions these days about training in-house personnel. So when is it a good idea to retrain an in-house employee for an HIT position in your judgment?
Well, I think, number one, anytime there's some sort of a government mandate, it's going to change how things are being done. And it would always be good to have an expert on staff that stays in touch with those issues. So whenever something new happens, you can go to an outsider initially, but it's going to be good to have somebody in-house who's trained and fully aware of everything that the organization has to stay in line with. I'd say that'd be number one. Number two is maybe when you have some sort of an organizational restructuring, maybe a position's eliminated, maybe the type of work that a long-term employee who has always been good at delivering what's expected from them. Maybe the role they're in for some reason has to be eliminated and new roles are created. That'd be a great time to take somebody who has been proven to be a great fit within the organization and get them trained in an area so that they can stay with the organization. I also think that that gains a lot of loyalty from other employees when they see that you're willing to take the time to invest in people who've shown a commitment to the organization. Anytime there's budget constraints, if you foresee long-term budget constraints, that might change the options you have available from a financial standpoint. Consultants are great. They're great from the standpoint of bringing in an area of expertise that you need immediately and being able to end that engagement, have the flexibility to end the engagement whenever you need to, but they're also expensive. So if you see budget restraints coming down the road where you may not have as much access to the consultants like you've had in the past, then it may begin to be a time when you can start identifying some people internally and get them trained to be those experts for you in-house. And then lastly, just generally, people get burnt out doing the same thing over and over. People want to feel like they're growing. So anytime you can take good performers internally, people that get the job done constantly and fit in great with the company and the culture, just providing additional training was certainly, I found, in the long run, helping with retention and keeping people loyal to the organization.
So how can clinical providers and sites optimize their resources relating to HIT? What are some good general strategies?
Well, number one, I think you can develop strong partnerships with staffing firms, with firms that have a staffing expertise. I think the more you can spend the time, there's some research that needs to be done on your part to make sure you're doing this with someone that you think is a good, viable partner long term, but the more time organizations spend with us and educating us on the skills and knowledge they have in-house and what they foresee needing down the road, the better job we're able to do to make sure we have those resources available to them when they need them. So a good, strong partnership with a consulting or staffing organization. Secondly, just continually offering ongoing training and certifications. I think your internal staff should be looked upon first as your number one priority in keeping knowledge in-house, up to date. So that's number two. And then I think lastly, having somebody committed within your organization, being a part to be a part of industry associations, industry organizations, just a constant frame of reference point to compare how your organization is doing to other organizations out there, as well as that commitment to these organizations to stay on top of what trends are coming down the road or what initiatives are coming down the road. A lot of times if you can, small adjustments can be made to your projects today that will make things a lot easier to comply with things down the road, but somebody's got to stay in touch with what's going on down the road so that you can make those good decisions.
And in some of these areas of specialization, it's not going to be easy for anyone who isn't really plugged in to know exactly what's coming down the road.
That's right. It's just an effort. It's just somebody or a couple of people in different, focused on different areas within the organization that are just taking a little bit of time frequently to stay in touch with what those trends are. It's very hard to predict, but when the mandates come down, everybody hears of them. But it's hard to predict unless you invest the time to staying in touch with these trends.
So I'd like to open up the floor to questions from our attendees. If you type the questions into your chat area, I'll be happy to pass them on. But before we do that, I'd like to ask a question myself. I think we all know that there's a shortage of HIT specialists, and that's why I'm sure that has something to do with the proliferation of recruiting firms that you were talking about earlier. But I wonder how that constraint affects the calculus on contractors versus full-time employment, because my understanding is that it's not always easy to find a full-time employee, especially if relocation is involved. So I wonder if you could expound on that just a little bit in terms of how the market is and demand for employees is shaping some of these considerations for companies and providers.
Well, the demand certainly is a factor. It starts with the full-time employee. people generally start their career in a full-time employee type role, and then over time, if they feel there's a demand for their skill set, some will venture into more of a project basis, and there's a number of reasons for that. Some people live in remote areas that there's no other HIT position for them, so they're willing to go into contracting to have more access to projects that are appealing to them. Financially, it can be more lucrative for people. They can earn more money. Some people, they do it to make more money while they're working, but don't look to make more money overall through the course of the year. So they may work a couple projects and then take a lot of time off. Those are as demand picks up, the people who are generally more comfortable in a full-time role become more comfortable in a contract role. The general thing that people are concerned about in a contract role is they know there will be a time when they're unemployed, and what reduces the risk in their mind is the demand for their skill set, so that there'll be another project fairly quickly. So the more the demand is there, the more it makes people who are in full-time roles more comfortable venturing into a contract or consulting scenario.
Because to make sure I understand, you're saying that really it's kind of a safety net issue for them, that as long as they're confident that there's going to be sufficient demand for their skills, there's not a lot of risk in becoming like a freelance consultant as opposed to a full-time employee. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. That's the feeling they have. Absolutely.
Okay.
And, the second challenge, though, and I saw this going back to 2008, before the recession took place and the housing issues took place, is, I can't say we've ever done any scientific tracking of this, but what I would say is when we were recruiting for our clients, let's say we have a client in, I'll just say Florida, and they need somebody with a specific skill set. And there was only, and as an example, let's say they were looking for a pharmacist familiar with Cerner applications. Well, there may be one other organization that even employs, that even uses Cerner, so there's only one other place to potentially recruit from. So what they end up doing is recruiting on a national basis. Prior to 2008, I would find that 1 in 10 people might be open to relocation for a position, and that doesn't mean that they'd be open to anywhere in the country. There's just some specific areas, given the right career situation, they would be open to considering that geography. Well, then the housing crisis took place in many states. Of course, housing prices fell, and I think that number's jumped to about, it's starting to get better now, but that 1 in 10 might have turned to 1 in 50, just from the standpoint that even though there were people who were willing to relocate, it became much more difficult because of people being underwater from a pricing standpoint.
Right. They said, I'll relocate if you buy my house, but otherwise forget it.
Exactly, and that's just not going to happen in most situations. So, and even for people who didn't have equity issues, it just became a lot harder to get loans. So the pool that people looked to recruit from for full-time roles dried up, not having anything to do with the amount of people that were out there, but in the logistics that are required to get those people hired. So that's been another reason why people who have been in full-time roles, who were not willing or who cannot relocate but want a new challenge, are now considering contracting or consulting as a way to kind of rejuvenate their careers and stay excited about what they're doing.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about those factors that are quite apart from HIT, really, but
yes.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Here's a question from the audience. Given the high demand for HIT personnel, do you see a full-time position being offered by an organization that allows for the consultant to be a remote consultant? So I'm not completely sure. Maybe the question is, do you think that there's room for full-time remote employees? Maybe that's what the questioner is trying to get at, or what's your take on that question?
Well, let me separate into, well, if the question is, are they looking for a full-time employee who can work 100% remote? There's a few out there, but I have not seen that very often as a full-time employee. What I have seen is somebody go in as a consultant who's traveling. Something we haven't mentioned is that typically the consultants do travel in. They're on site at the client site Monday through Thursday. That tends to be the biggest reason, or the number one reason why people do not get into contracting or consulting, is that their lifestyle doesn't accommodate being away from home at least 3 nights a week. So what I have seen are people who have been a consultant for an organization. They're flying somebody in. It's costly to fly them in. The organization begins to see that they will need this skill set long term, and then they'll work out an arrangement where that person doesn't have to fly in and becomes more of an employee to the organization. I have not seen many, although I'm a little surprised I haven't seen more, but I haven't seen many organizations adopt a strategy yet where they're willing to hire people as employees to work remotely 100% of the time, or to some extent maybe even fly them in once a month for a couple of days. I've seen them, but I'd say it's less than 2-3% right now.
All right. You talked about how important it is for recruiting companies to have specialization in the area that the provider needs assistance in, that they need employment assistance in. And I'm wondering, how do you, so you talked about some of the big boys like Cerner and Siemens, I believe you mentioned. What about when it comes to smaller EHR companies? Because there's such a wild west of new EHR companies popping up, it seems, every day. I think there's something like more than 700 of them now. What if you can't find an organization that specializes in that particular area, or what are your thoughts on that more generally?
Well, that's hard to answer very quickly, but generally speaking, it's a challenge. I think it's, you know, I used to give an analogy where it's an organization who's, let's say you have a race car team, and you built this great car, but you don't have any idea who's going to drive it just yet. And so when you look at the software you're going to bring in, this is very critical in running your organization or departments within your organization. I think ahead of time, you have to really look into the resources. Are the resources there? Can the vendor supply the resources you need? If the vendor's going to supply the resources you need and that's going to be the only reliable avenue you have, should that be negotiated in the contract prior to purchasing the software? And, you know, so these are things that I think have to be thought of ahead of time. The other avenue is the training that's provided. Maybe you've got to look at an investment in training your current people, where many organizations default to saying we're going to implement new software and then we're going to hire outside staff to become full-time employees, or even look for consulting staff. Maybe there's training that needs to be done ahead of time before projects even begin. But I think that's something that just has to be looked at ahead of time. If you get to the point where you need to hire somebody and the people aren't there, there's just, you know, Brian, there's just not a lot you can do about it at that point, right?
Right.
If the people aren't there, and you see that quite a bit. You see, you know, you can run metrics and say that, you know, the new software vendor has sold 10 systems, but it's the first, let's just say, you know, it's the first 10 systems they've sold. Well, normally in the bigger markets, there's organizations that have been using a large vendor software for a long time, so there's people that have worked on it, been trained on it, that are out there that you can recruit. But when an organization's small, that's one of the challenges. So they sell 10 systems, you need 3 people per organization to support it. Well, that's 30 people that the market needs today that they didn't need yesterday. And a lot of times they're just not there. So there's not a lot you can do once you get to that point. The key is to giving thought to how you're going to deal with your staffing issues and what knowledge you're going to need in-house to support that system or implement that system prior to making the purchase.
That's another example, and it struck me throughout your comments today that a lot of this really involves advanced planning and careful thought on the part of the employer to really know they need to know the resources that they're going to need, because otherwise, that, you know, they can get themselves into a kind of cul-de-sac where there really aren't recruiting solutions available because, you know, because of the circumstances.
That's right. You hit it right there.
Here's another question from the audience. What do you see specifically on the billing and coding side to bring up candidates to the new impending ICD-10 and getting them to the needed knowledge level? So I guess from a recruiting perspective, what can you tell us about ICD-10 and what you see going on in the industry right now?
Well, that's not an area that our firm specializes in specifically, so I'm not going to be the expert to really get into the nuts and bolts with that. Having said that, every client that we're working with is having to deal with it, so I certainly hear about what they're going through. And the key is first understanding what the timelines are and what needs to be done. And then lastly, it's just a matter of providing training. There's outside resources that most organizations that are taking ICD-10 seriously and are on pace to be compliant at the right time. I've heard recently that they're making announcements that they're pushing the date back again. I've seen that come out. I believe through HIM's announcements, reporting some things that were said. But it's just a matter of them getting their people trained, and how they do it is varying from organization to organization. The resources are tough. They're trying to maintain what's taking place now while migrating to what's going to be necessary at the end of next year. And you know, sometimes they're complex issues, but it comes down to the organizations have to invest the time to get their people up to speed with the knowledge that's necessary.
All right. Here's another question. We've got a couple of questions about certifications. So I'll do them separately because they're a little bit different. First, do you think PMP certifications, so project management, or perhaps other HIT certifications, are needed for a consultant to succeed, or do you think that work experience trumps the certifications?
Generally speaking, work experience trumps the certifications. When it comes to a project manager, that PMP, in my opinion, comes from what clients ask us for. That's where I'm forming my opinions, just to let you know that that's where I'm gathering my information. But when it comes to a project manager, the clients always ask for the PMP. That doesn't mean if the right resource with the right experience surfaces and does not have one that they won't hire them, but they always ask for it. So it's just one extra hurdle somebody doesn't have to go through if they have it. But generally speaking, in all other areas, the work experience is going to trump the certifications. And that makes it very difficult because the work experience is just getting your foot in the door and being prepared and having planned your career to have the kind of background that somebody's going to want to hire and train. But sometimes you have to get a little bit lucky that the right position is there at the right time. But, you know, so for instance, today, if I've got a client that needs someone to come in with a specific area of Cerner experience to help implement a system, and you know, they have somebody with 4 years of experience all working with Cerner with those specific hands-on skills, or I could have a 15-year HIT professional who's never worked with Cerner but has certification. If it requires a hands-on skill, they're going to go to the hands-on skill 4-year person first. That's what we're seeing today. All
right. So here's the second question along those lines, and it's related to what we're just saying. And I've heard this question asked a lot in other contexts. So the question is, I'm looking for a new job opportunity now, but the big software vendors such as Epic and Siemens require certification, and you have to get the certification through them. How do you get in if you don't have that certification? So in other words, how do you become an Epic trainer if you don't, if you never have the chance to get certified in Epic? But you have to be certified in order to be an Epic trainer, whatever, along those lines.
Exactly. Well, when you started listing the vendors, I heard you say Epic, I heard you say Siemens. You cut out for a second. Was there another that you mentioned in there?
Not in this particular question.
Okay. Okay. So to my knowledge, the one vendor that has, I guess, the mandates for certifications would be Epic. Epic is very big on making sure that their clients bring people aboard onto their projects that have been certified. The rest of them, it's more a matter of having the experience. That question that was asked has probably been asked more times than any question that I've ever heard. It's the chicken or the egg, and the answer, I guess, is you don't. You can't get, to my knowledge, Epic doesn't allow people to just walk in the door, pay for training. They just don't allow people to do that. There are it's one of the reasons why our firm right now doesn't do Epic, because if we can't offer a certified resource to the client based upon what's been told by Epic, and again, I don't work in Epic, so I can't, there may be some variations on what I'm saying, but then I can't offer them, the right resources. Now, I'm not, so that's where firms that are going to work in the Epic space would have to, they become certified partners of Epic, to my knowledge, or preferred vendors of Epic, and with that type of relationship in place, those consulting firms can then send a certain amount of people to Epic for training, which is my understanding. So it would be then maybe a matter of having an overall type of skill set and knowledge base that a consulting firm would want to hire and then invest in, and that's the best way that I've seen it. I've seen people who don't have Epic experience get hired by consulting firms, or get hired because of their overall knowledge by a hospital that needs somebody on an Epic project, and then either the consulting firm or the hospital, because of their relationship with, say, Epic, will get them access to that certification or training.
That's what I've heard, that Epic is a special case, and that's essentially the only way to get in, is that it's almost like you have to be sponsored by the organization.
Exactly.
Well, let's move on to another question from the audience. Here's a good question. How does traditional education improve a candidate's value in the HIT realm, or is it really a matter of certification? And I guess you could add to that work experience. So is formal, four-year education or clinical background's a separate question, but is traditional education important for HIT?
Well, I think the way I answered, generally try to say that is the more you have, the better. But again, it's going to default back to if somebody's trying to get a position and assuming that there's competition for the position, the experience is going to be more highly looked upon. From the clinical standpoint, absolutely. So you're either dealing with assisting in the design of how a system's going to be implemented, which relies on clinical knowledge and workflow knowledge, which will come from the foundation of a clinical education and then some work experience, or you're then going to be using your hands-on skills and knowledge of a specific application in doing the tasks that are necessary to get that system implemented based upon the knowledge of the workflows and the design and so forth. So from, again, my experience, and you have to keep in mind that companies will come to a firm like ours for a level of expertise. They're not always coming to a firm like ours for somebody brand new to the industry. But in talking with the clients that we have, even when they're hiring people in the more entry or intermediate type roles, I don't see, it can be very challenging for someone who doesn't have the clinical background, the clinical education, or the IT familiarity with the application. What they will tend to do is go to some power user, some clinical user, who they call kind of a super user of the application, who really understands that, and then bring them into the IT department or the informatics department.
Here we have a follow-up question to the remote employment, and the question is, with the explosion of remote access technologies such as Skype and WebEx and that sort of thing, do you think that organizations will begin to use more remote workers, whether it's consulting or otherwise, I suppose, because then they can get the resources they need without having all of the associated costs and complications of having someone relocate? Or is there just too much resistance from the organizations on that sort of remote work? What are you seeing? Is there change on the horizon, or do you not see it?
Well, I think when you look at the numbers, at some point I think it has to change. I think when you just, as somebody who's been in staffing for a number of years, the big picture says there's 60 million, baby boomers retiring, and 40 or 35 million Gen Xers coming behind them. So what that says is you have more people retiring than there are people to replace them, just in general. And then you take in the fact of housing issues, relocation issues. People just aren't moving today for positions. They're not relocating for positions today, maybe like they did 20 years ago. So when you look at that, what I'm saying is that I think the organizations are going to have to get a little more creative in terms of what they're doing for their staffing. But it also comes back to what you've alluded to a couple times, Brian, is it all depends on the planning. Because the flip side of that is so long as, let's say, hospital organizations are continually hiring nurses and pharmacists and pharm techs who are gaining knowledge of, clinical knowledge and workflows, and if enough of those people within an organization have an interest in learning the technology, and if the organization is planning ahead, then they may have access to a pool of people that would be ideal to be trained and are already local to them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So here's another question about ICD-10. You said that it's not something that your firm deals with very often, but what advice could you give to people then who need ICD-10 recruiting solutions? Because you also talked about how it's kind of, to some extent, there's a wild west of recruiting now. So what advice could you give to someone who's seeking recruiting assistance on ICD-10? How should they think about finding the right recruiting firm?
Well, I would just go about reaching out to maybe colleagues or peers who've used outside recruiting firms or contracting firms. I would start there and see who they've used with some success. I might reach out to some of the what's the word I'm looking for? The industry organizations. I'm sure that there are people that you could reach out to there who've had experience working with consulting or contracting firms. And just start from that standpoint. I try to start with word of mouth if I could, going to people who you trust and feel have credibility in your mind, and networking your way into finding who they've used and start my process that way.
I noticed that you didn't say just Google it and hope for the best. ICD-10 and HIPAA training and that sort of thing, it's amazing what you'll find out there if you just organically search. And a lot of it isn't very good.
Well, now that you say that, it's funny. It makes me realize maybe my mind doesn't immediately go that route. Maybe there's some areas where it should, but I guess when I'm buying a product or service, and I'd like to start with people who've already used it and can speak highly of it, if that makes sense.
Sure. So you talked before about how it's important for providers to have kind of a, I don't know if you'd call it long-term, but an ongoing relationship with the right recruiting firm. I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that in terms of why is that important, and what, I guess, what is the upside to it? How does it work?
Well, let me separate them quickly.
Please.
On the contracting side, it's about having the right person at the right time. So the more you're in touch with, the more you have a relationship with your staffing partner from a contract standpoint, the more they're going to be willing to invest the time to make sure that they have the people there when you say you're going to need them. There has to be a trust and a partnership there. Until you have a proven track record with until that staffing firm has impressed you enough, you're not going to want to invest the time with them. But if a staffing firm doesn't know you, how much time are they going to invest in someone that they don't know who calls them up and says, we want you to be prepared to have resources for us 2 months from now? It's kind of a two-way street, so there's got to be trust both ways. And the more that trust is established, the more they're willing to put the time in to make sure you'll have the right resources. The contracting firm is not going to be earning revenue for their company until you hire and are using that resource. So in order to build, and as we said before, you want to plan with them. So there has to be a trust there for them to willing to take the time to plan, that they can trust you'll call them at the appropriate time and actually utilize what it is you've called them for, if that makes sense. On the permanent side, there's the side of going out and finding the right skill sets you need. But most of the time when you're finding the right permanent full-time employee, it's not a matter of just finding the right resource, I found someone who's qualified. It's also being able to talk about the organization, who hopefully is, your client and someone you're partnering with. It's talking about that organization in a way like you really know them. When you're talking to candidates in the marketplace about one of your clients, one of their opportunities, if you think about it, if they're going to be looking at this position, they're probably looking at other positions as well. So savvy candidates who have options, they can tell based upon how you speak about the client, how much detail you know about the client, how intricate you can get, how you can speak about the personality. They can tell whether or not you really know this client or not. And the more you can project that, the higher the likelihood you have of actually attracting this person to the client that you're recruiting for. So this is a question where I could give multiple bullet points for each of these scenarios, but I just tried to give one big, broad brushstroke of an example on how partnering with those firms will actually benefit you, the client, in terms of how good they can do their job. And the better they can do their job, the more options you're going to have to choose from.
Well, thank you. So I'm afraid we're nearly out of time. I want to remind our attendees that we're going to assemble the audience questions and post the answers on our site with links delivered via email later in the week. I really want to thank you, David, because this has been very informative. I think we've all learned a lot about the trade-offs between consulting and FTE and when to go with one or the other. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
You're welcome, Brian. Thanks for having me.
To learn more about our industry expert and his professional services, you can visit healthcareis.com. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees today. Remember that all registered attendees will receive an email with links to both recorded and PDF versions of this session. Visit formedtraining.com to register for our Certified Healthcare Technology Hiring Professional course, which is designed for recruiters and other HR professionals in health IT. Be sure to join us at Formed Approved for our next Learning Lunch session, which will air on May 21st, and will cover the subject of understanding value-based plans, pay for performance, and ACOs. Keep an eye on your email box and our homepage for other upcoming topics. Thank you again to all of you for joining us today.